Hey Harriet, how are you?
I'm good, Marcus. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm a little bit stressed out because, and I need to explain why I have a green screen behind me rather than the usual branded background. Yesterday, I
Yeah.
very cleverly spilt coffee all over my laptop, destroyed
Ouch.
it.
Oh no.
Office this morning, unlocked it for the first time in 2 months, brought another laptop home, and it hasn't got the up-to-date OS, so it can't display the virtual background. So you've got me in green.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, I quite like it. It brings out the best in your hair and shirt. So, it's working for you on an aesthetic level.
Maybe we should rebrand then. Go for green.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
We have a cat.
I do. This is Rudyard. Say hi, Rudy. And there's a spaniel and a poodle behind the computer, but hopefully they won't intervene. I think one marauder is enough for the next hour.
Whole menagerie there then.
Yeah, I know. It's just, I don't know. New Yorkers love their dogs. It's a very dog-friendly city. And the cat's like 18 years old, so he's not going anywhere. Travels with me everywhere. So yeah, in it for the long haul.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Start off with where you are. So you're in New York, as you said, but in a very
Yeah,
English.
yeah. I'm in New York. I'm the dean at Pratt Institute School of Architecture. I started last August when I thought I was actually just applying for a dean job and not to run the School of Architecture in a pandemic. So things have been quite interesting since I arrived. And I think that, New York right now, it's an incredibly resilient city. It always has been. I mean, if you look at the history of the city, it's survived every kind of bankruptcy, every kind of challenge. Hello, Rudy. And I think that, that we'll get through this for sure. And we've all been terribly well behaved, like serious social distancing. And it's really had an impact on infection rates. So that's really encouraging. It's unfortunate, however, that today many other states are opening. And so quite how that will translate as people start to move between states in relation to rising infection rates is obviously a big concern. But New Yorkers are standing strong. So it's encouraging to be here, I think.
And it must be getting warm out there as well.
Yeah, I'm in a woolen sweater, as you can see. I mean, New York's definitely always got that range of temperatures. You can start out cold and then it gets super hot. But I kind of like that about it, really. You can go through sort of 4 seasons of clothing in one day if you feel like it, if you're so inclined. I think fashion designers probably like it here for that reason. Got an excuse that's environmentally prompted for many changes. But yeah, it's kind of strange because it should be hotter because it's May, but it's not yet. As where it should be, and it will get super hot, and that I think may have an impact on infection rates again, but we'll see.
So tell us a little bit about yourself then. You told us what you're doing out in New York at the moment, but what about before that? What's your background?
Yeah, so I'm a qualified architect, UK registered, and I was at the Royal College of Arts before I took the job at Pratt Institute. I'm also a writer, so I've written books on architectural education principally, and also looking at issues relating to women in architecture and design, so representation, understanding the nature of the archive. So how do we capture and value design knowledge, design curriculum? I'm very interested in deconstructing the canon around that agenda, and I think that relates to my talk shortly. But yeah, so I'm, I guess, somewhere between a scholar, a manager, and a practitioner, but principally at the moment, largely a manager. But yeah, Pratt's great. I mean, it's a very democratic school. I'm trying to give my faculty and students even more agency because I really think that's the way to go in this day and age, really making sure that we do things collaboratively and collectively. So it's an exciting time, I think, to be a dean. There's a real shift in culture towards collectivism that really wasn't there when I was a student. It was very hierarchical. So yeah, it's a good time, I think.
And also a shift towards female deans. I mean, there's from being hardly any, there's several of you now.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some people would describe this as the glass cliff face. When women are brought in to fix things. And I think in some ways there wasn't really anything broken about necessarily schools of architecture, although perhaps some aspects could have done with some improvement. But I think that it is encouraging to see just a willingness to see more diversification of leadership, really. I mean, we're still a minority. But if you look at the COVID crisis, for example, the safest place to be right now, statistically, is in a country that's run by a woman, because they have the lowest infection rates compared to countries run by men. So, I think that hopefully I'll get my school through on the same terms. But yeah, I think it's good to have different forms of leadership because obviously leaders and also whoever they bring with them, in other words, my faculty in my case, can set a pedagogic agenda for a school that is really oriented towards a wider sense of inclusion. So I think that's quite important. And I'm really encouraged to see so many deans, especially in North America, who are women, who are really trying to do something different in each of their schools.
And we've met just twice before, I think. The first time when we did this panel discussion about the influence and legacy of the Bauhaus at the Design Museum, I think it was in March last year, where you very passionately stood up for the women of the Bauhaus, which I think now it's been recognised that the women played a key role in developing the aesthetic and the colours and things like that. But it's taken a while for that story to be told, hasn't it?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it comes down. So this is New York traffic rage. It's really common. Apologies. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues with the Bauhaus is that typically, often the work of women is misunderstood or even just not really recognised in the same way. It comes down to, in a way, the materiality of the canon. If we only really look at the canon, sorry, this is so New York. So New York, everyone. You know, if we think, I think one of the problems we have with what constitutes a canon in any discipline is its materiality. So it's always about the big commission, or it's about the big project, the large scale monograph, for example, and it's never really about often the kind of interdisciplinary work or the smaller commissions or the work of being a collaborator or an agent or a commissioner. So I think with the Bauhaus, you know, women were very discouraged from doing any sort of spatial disciplines. In fact, Gropius even believed that women couldn't think in 3 dimensions. He believed they could only think in 2. So he didn't really encourage them at all to do any kind of spatial design. So I've been writing and will be published next year about my research into the women of the Bauhaus and how they were all, many of them directed into weaving, but then used the loom as a means to express their frustration about their desire to become 3-dimensional designers. And so it's very interesting looking at their contribution. Sometimes they express through other mediums, but in other ways through children's toys or games or furniture. So yeah, that's been a piece of research I've been quite passionate about.
And then, of course, you spoke on a panel at Dezeen Day, our conference in London at the end of October, where there were some fireworks, if I recall.
Yeah. I thought I was being terribly polite to Patrik. I didn't realise a fireworks kind of lit up after I think the event ended. But you know, yeah, Patrik, I mean, I guess it must get a bit exhausting playing the bad boy of architecture all the time. And I suppose sometimes as well, like, you know, Patrik's platform is a bit problematic because it's like, you know, it kind of shifts the debate more towards a sense of like the middle ground being somewhere between somebody like me who believes in paying people properly, who believes in, you know, decent working hours, who believes in, you know, a banning of unpaid internships, towards somebody like Patrik who thinks Brexit is a good thing because it means he can fire his workers quicker, which is obviously something opinion he shared with me. So I think that you know, I think I'm not necessarily as far to the kind of left as one might assume, but you know, Patrik's is quite far right. So I think sometimes we can too easily get tilted towards, you know, his perspective as being somehow more moderate than it actually is. But I think that most architects don't share his view. And it's unfortunate that in a way he's not really doing much to endear the public to architecture, which is a shame because there are so many other architects doing incredible work who really deserve a platform. And I know that obviously Dezeen does a lot of great platforming for architects doing incredible civic and ethical and environmentally sustainable work, and that's amazing. But not all architecture media is like that, and that's unfortunate.
Well, thank you for that, Harriet. It's very kind of you to say so. And that's Patrik Schumacher you're talking about, who was on the panel, for people who don't know. All right then, so what have you got to show us? You've got a little presentation.
Yeah, I have. You know me, I like to be a little bit of a provocateur. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my agendas at my school since I arrived. So let me just start by sharing my screen and getting this into presentation mode. Can I see it? I hope I can't see it. Oh wait, there we go. Right, okay, great. So, so as I mentioned, I'm quite new to deaning. And in a way I did it as a bit of a gamble. I thought, actually, you know, what do I know about deans? Well, often they're quite narcissistic, quite egotistical, quite self-serving. Is that the kind of job description, or can you be a different kind of dean? And I kind of thought, well, if I applied for a dean job, I'd want to do it my way. And my way is really about trying to democratize the role. So I came into Pratt, and very quickly it became clear that there's a really strong tradition at the school of civic engagement. It's got a phenomenal planning department. It's always been completely engaged in its local community in Brooklyn. And there's remarkable faculty who've been always doing these kind of civic projects, but it's not necessarily on everybody's radar. And I think that there's a real spirit of willingness towards democratizing the school, and also within our own institutional strategic plan, because most schools of architecture now have strategic plans, and institutes do. We're quite committed to the idea of diversity inclusion, but we don't really unpack that. Like, what does that really mean for a school that's trying to commit to inclusivity and diversity, not just in terms of faculty representation, but also in terms of student body, and of course the impact on the profession. So, as I mentioned before, I'm an architect.
Harriet, sorry, can you put the images full screen? Play the presentation, or that's it?
Yeah, is that okay? Sorry, I'm not doing that. Great. So can I do it that way, or is that? Oh wait, hold on. If I do that, then I see what you mean.
Just go through the presentations if it was a normal presentation using the.
Yeah, got it. I just lose my notes when I do that. That's the only problem. Let me see if I can pull them up on my phone, and then I can do both, because I don't want to lose my notes. You see, I've put a lot of sorry, because it doesn't let you do presenter view in this thing. So give me 1 second.
Fine.
No, it's okay, because I'm just going to do a cunning thing where I just put it onto my phone, and then I can do it, no problem. But yeah, this will work, promise. Okay, right, we're back in business. Thank you for your patience. So present, got it. Okay, so as I mentioned before, my writing is principally focused on two themes really. One is architecture and social justice, which concerns obviously gender representation and participation, but also the design of architecture education, which I think includes an analysis of the latent value and potential impact of an architecture degree, which is my forthcoming book with Rory Hyde and Roberta Maracaccio. Maybe I'll talk about that later. But I really want to talk about the design of design education, because in a way, to be a dean is to be a kind of designer of a school, a designer of an agenda and a kind of mission statement for a school. So that's really what I'm doing right now. And I want to talk a bit about what it takes to really understand what basically what diversifying a school of architecture looks like. So after looking at this extensively, it really comes down to the need to decolonize architecture education. And I think a lot of designers are probably familiar with this as a notion, but they probably realize, they identify it with something that maybe happened in South Africa, in 2015 with the Roads Must Fall campaign against former statues of colonialists. We've obviously seen the same in Oxford University in the UK, and also in Charlottesville with General Lee. But I think that there's a misapprehension about what decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing design education really looks like. There's an assumption that it's maybe just involves, I don't know, dead colonialists, and it's really a problem that only people of color in distant lands have to contend with, and not really at all relevant to everyday design practice in the Northern Hemisphere. My argument is that it really does affect us, and it's really embedded in how we operate as designers, which is not necessarily conscious of this. And I think it comes down to really looking at the profile of the profession, how we know it's unrepresentative, we know it's not diverse, and we know that fundamentally design and architecture especially are really struggling with being ethical, inclusive, and representative. So I think that if we really want to change the sector, we really need to start looking at how we redesign architecture education. So I think one of the main problems is that you have a curriculum that's really about what someone has politely called, who I won't call out because they're a bit shy about this quote, the architecture of four men. So in other words, architecture's canon, i.e. the established knowledge base under which we take as our kind of foundation, both theoretical and practical, privileges a certain way of looking at the world, a certain form of spatial production. So it's this idea that, European models of production and spatial form somehow preeminent over other regions. And of course, if you look at the student body now, we're all increasingly internationalized. I mean, visas permitting, obviously, given the COVID crisis. But that curriculum is no longer really that relevant, and also doesn't really reflect not only the faculty or the student body, but the needs of the society that the design and architecture industry is designed to serve. So I think what we need to understand is that, education, even though it's often assumed to be some bubble of play where everything is terribly meritocratic and, tutors and students chest bump each other in the corridors and talk about how, much they relate to each other as friends, it's still full of privilege, it's still full of authority. And I would say a lot of notions of what is avant-garde forms of culture are really quite tied to giving the West and the Northern Hemisphere a massive advantage over other forms of cultural production in other regions. So this kind of comes down to, decolonization, not just as being a problem, if you like, for minorities, as we would call them in the US, or BAME in the UK, but being a problem that's about all forms of inequality. So in a way, to decolonize is to embrace many of the, I would argue, ambitions of social movements. And what I mean by social movements, well, a social movement is everything from LGBTQ rights, it's Black Lives Matter, it's feminism, it's all forms of activism, it's people joining unions and protesting against student fees. It's all part of the same project, which is to stand up to power and a power structure that relies upon inequality between humans and also other species in order to make profits and polarize wealth. And that's really the problem that we're all laboring under. So, of course, why is that difficult? Well, if you think about it in terms of, if you like, what kind of architecture and design is produced, this a relentless privileging of Northern Hemisphere spatial production and all forms of aesthetic production relies upon, I would say, a very unequal exchange. So what you have is, the amount of pollution that goes into producing the surfeit of objects and furniture and accessories and spaces that the Northern Hemisphere demands. And to do that, we need to take all of the natural resources from the global south. And if you like, the payback is to send them higher temperatures, flooding, climate catastrophe, and all our waste, whether it's in the form of shipping containers and recycling, or just more generally toxicity from other forms of spatial production. So I think that, we don't really want to speak about this too often, I think, as designers. It's just an assumption, again, because it's not, as long as we're recycling diligently and we might, I don't know, make the odd flower pot out of composite concrete with a little bit of hemp thrown in, that somehow that's, I don't know, ameliorates the situation. It's like a neutralizing force. And I don't really think it is. I think that what we have is an issue around this idea about what sustainable is in design. It's very easy to think of it as raw materials, as just, if you like, the clock starts ticking when raw materials arrive in the Northern Hemisphere, not when they're necessarily being mined by children in parts of Africa or Asia. So what we don't understand about what we call embodied energy is that it's much more about energy, as it's known. And this notion of energy is around the idea that you need to start to look not only at how and what and who is extracting the resources needed to make our sustainable products, but then what's the life cycle beyond their use. So concrete doesn't break down, it's polluting the planet, et cetera, within the space of this presentation, which is roughly 10 minutes, you could fill the Royal Albert Hall in concrete, just that's how quickly it's being poured. So I think that we have, an ongoing crisis about all this surfeit of materials and toxic materials that we're creating. So when we think about colonialism, we often think that it's a past project, it's just these old colonies and they've all been liberated now, first through the Commonwealth, which is a questionable form of liberation, and now, as independent nations. But it's really continuing because really, I think the climate crisis is really fueling it. And I'm very cautious about the terms I use here. I don't like using climate change because that just sounds like something that, I don't know, like a season that's shifting. It is acutely a climate crisis. I don't like the way we describe, global warming isn't really the right term to describe it. It's global overheating. Similarly, natural resources are actually not necessarily resources. They're finite pieces of nature that we are culling, chopping down, setting fire to, burning. And similarly, fossil fuels, it's not a fuel that you're a fossil by default. They're fossil matter, but they're not fuel. So I think that even in the language of how architects and designers speak about the resources available to them, there's really needs to be a kind of more rigorous interrogation of how we describe sustainability and how we describe responsible design. So what can designers really do to decolonize design? So I think it's really about saying that if you're committed to climate change, that decolonization is the first step towards addressing climate change and climate crisis. Because I think that, again, the embeddedness of these inequalities between the North and South and the materials and everything I've just explained means that the two are incredibly linked together. So this, how people are treated, the exclusion of certain groups from spatial production, and the direction of travel of materials and resources is all part of the same problem. And I think that, I would argue, and I think this is, it's been argued many times before, that we aren't really in this together, that how climate change affects us in the Northern Hemisphere right now is nothing like as acute as it is if you're living in parts of Asia right now where there's major flooding. So we're not really all in this together, but I believe very strongly in the idea of solidarity. And by that, I mean, all of us are in this together if we want to find a solution, because it can't just be a problem that's pushed onto those regions, a bit like some impossible puzzle, and expect them to figure their way out of it, because it relies upon all of us to make that change. So I think the question then, which I was here to answer, is what can schools do to decolonize? And it's really for me about doing, nuts and bolts stuff. So who is teaching in your school? Who is on a precarious contract? Who isn't? Are you doing enough to support diversity within your school through scholarships or other forms of facilitation? The pedagogy and curriculum of schools of architecture has been designed to privilege a certain kind of learner. So again, looking outside of non-Western pedagogic processes, non-Western curriculum, simple detox is adjust all the reading lists to make them more equitable, not just by minority representation, but by region. Give students briefs that actually invite them to rethink the crisis outside of their immediate context, get them to work collaboratively, emphasizing collectivism and collaboration, particularly with excluded communities and minorities as part of a design process. And truthfully, we need the RIBA, the NAAB, which is the American validation system, and other design accreditation boards to really step up and give, I think, schools of architecture not just a mandate, but an obligation to become much more decolonized, much more sustainable. I think, as a relatively new dean, oh, hello, Kat. What I want to do, and I feel what I'm obliged to do, is to make sure that students are prepared for a practice that's going to be very, very different, especially post-COVID, when we've really come to terms with what inequality means. And they need to operate really as people who are going to save us all, given that we've created a mess and dumped it on their laps, and they've got to figure it out with very little support from us. But I want them to make sure that they come out of schools feeling very capable and able to address issues of ethics, questions of accountability, appropriation, indigenization, colonization. And unless the curriculum shifts to do this, they're not going to be prepared to really face the problems that are facing them in the world. So that's pretty much my pitch for decolonizing education for today. And the cats come to just celebrate at the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So in practical terms, how are you going to roll out these ideas at Pratt? Have you already started, and do you have targets and goals and timeframes? How does that work?
Yeah, so firstly, I think the scholarship in relation to decolonizing the curriculum and just decolonizing education more generally is really starting to come to the fore. There's a real adjustment around what constitutes authority in relation to transforming schools of architecture and just colleges more generally. At Pratt, for example, one of the things we've done is we've completely changed the leadership and profile and membership of what we have. We have a curriculum committee to make it more representative and diverse, and the mandate is to enact new models of climate justice education and new models of social justice education through the school curriculum. So really, we're not really waiting for a mandate right now from NAAB or RIBA for that matter. We're extremely focused on just, in a way, pioneering our own responsive curriculum and pedagogic approaches to inequality within schools, and obviously by implication more widely within society and the profession.
And how do you get more diverse students into the school? Because presumably if you're from a privileged background, you may know more about architecture, so you may have wealthier parents, so you may go to architecture school. That's simplifying it massively.
No, but it's a very true characterization, actually, rather unfortunately. And what I find astonishing is, we see so many women entering architecture school. I mean, the US, for example, is almost 50-50, similar to the UK. But if you look at how many women are registered architects in both countries, you're looking at 20-odd%. So, one of the challenges is it's not just getting them into school, it's keeping them in school. Because actually this is the problem, this comes back to the pedagogy and curriculum being biased towards certain kinds of students over others. Pedagogy is implicated because so many are leaving. Sorry, creaky door. And I think that the issue with that is that we need to, unless we make that adjustment, that this hemorrhaging of talent starts to happen before they even reach professional practice and then face a whole other set of inequalities. And I guess it comes down to the bigger question about education's ability, not just to reflect professional practice, but to direct it in many ways. So at the moment, education could have a much more powerful role in shaping the profile of the profession or the design industry more generally by changing the way education is taught. And I think there needs to be a shift away from privileging the outputs. There needs to be a bigger focusing on production understanding where do things come from, how can specification actually be ethical, how can specifications involve slavery or not, and what do we do about it, but also about encouraging, I think, students to reimagine what an architectural or design practice is. So see that as a design brief, like redesign the profession, make it more equitable, shift away from thinking that it's just this, the building is the output and that's the only output that we value or measure within schools of architecture, and make it so much more about seeing the structure of the design profession and even the structure of society as being potential design project worthy of their attention.
So how as an educator can you create a situation, prepare people for practice so that women, for example, don't drop out? They do stick around and become a practice. They do stick around, they do start their own firms using their own templates. How do you, as you're sort of the feeder of the profession, how do you gear people up for that?
It's a really good question. Firstly, I think it's about looking to your faculty and thinking, who's in a position of leadership here, who has authority, who's able to set an agenda for curriculum, whether it's design studio or as a chair or a head of program. I think it's also about making sure, and just if we continue with women, because obviously there are other people that are also not really represented within architecture, but it's also about looking to see what kind of projects we're setting the students. So I had a student a few years ago who did a feminist gym. I think there's been some really interesting projects that look at, and last year in fact I had a student who designed a women's refuge. So I think that it's very interesting allowing female students often to bring, I would say, end user concerns into the curriculum to sort of, and really that comes down to giving what I would describe as students autodidactic agency. So in other words, letting them be able to have a say over what subjects they choose, what regions they choose to base their projects in. I had a dreadful fight a few years ago, and I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, but I won't name her, with an external examiner who said it was inappropriate for some of my students who were from African descent to base their projects in Africa, because she thought that they should be focusing on Hackney along with everybody else who studies architecture in London. And I thought that was deeply problematic. We have an internationalized school, and what we needed was obviously to allow projects to reflect that diversity, not to say just because we couldn't all jet over there on an EasyJet flight for a weekend that we shouldn't necessarily make that subject of study. And it's that, again, this privileging of, well, if you come to England or even to the US, you have to study sites within this context, and that needs to shift too. So I think it really comes down to this question of agency, giving agency not just to faculty, especially those that are probably marginalized or have felt disempowered within your faculty, but also about giving agency to students. So at Pratt, for example, we now have a lecture series that's entirely student-led. They have their own budget, they organize it themselves. It's called Pratt Futures, and what they do is they determine who they think is innovative. So what it started to do is really shift the culture of who's an authority within the school, away from it just being the professors who select who they think the students should hear from. And instead it's much more about us listening to the students about whose practice models or whose business objectives or whose products and processes they think are important. And so we start to learn more from them. So it's, again, this kind of leveling that I'm really trying to achieve within that school culture, which is really about how we start to disrupt the hierarchy and make people feel a sense of belonging, authority, and empowerment within the school environment.
It's one thing to disrupt the hierarchy, but also how do you disrupt the cost of an architectural education? You were previously at the Royal College of Art, which famously, like so many international schools, they rely on overseas students who can pay fees. I don't know what the setup is at Pratt, but how that immediately excludes a large proportion of the world's population.
No, it's true. We have scholarships at Pratt. There are some scholarships at the RCA. I went to the RCA actually on full scholarship, and back then that meant all my fees and a living allowance, and I had to do some pretty creative jobs in order to make up the difference and take on loans like everybody else. So I know what it's like to be put in that situation, and I also know that now there are even fewer opportunities for scholarships in the UK and the US than they've ever been. And I think one of the issues I have, and it comes back to my point earlier about solidarity, like why am I, white middle class woman talking about decolonization? Of course there should be other people in this conversation with us, of course there should, but it comes down to sharing the responsibility for change. And I think that's really important. And I think one of the problems is that it's very, very easy when the problem is political for schools and students to infight, for us to blame each other. So, the problem becomes that we are in infighting. At the moment, there's all sorts of issues around COVID quality, you know, the standard of education under COVID at multiple schools across the US, faculty thrown into online teaching with no training in online teaching at a moment's notice, and everybody trying to adjust to these, you know, new learning environments, with a bit like me, with children, either children or animals bouncing off walls when you're either trying to run a school or teach a program. So I think that, you know, that our ability to kind of be generous towards each other, I think frankly has been a bit lacking. I think then there's an opportunity here to understand that the problem is not about schools who are, you know, as if it's really down to them making barriers to entry that are fee-based. It's really about different political systems having different kinds of political leadership that enshrine and issue the right to enshrine the right to a free education. And I think that I believe very strongly that everyone should have a free education. So we've now got a police helicopter. I promise I've done nothing wrong. I'm innocent. They're looking for somebody else, but it's not about my presentation, but not yet anyway. But I think, you know, the interesting thing is that the blame game that we're playing is exactly what I think certain types of political leadership want, because it's a distraction from where we should be putting all of our energy, which is much more geared towards, I think, confronting the structural problems that have got us into this mess to begin with.
How is Pratt coping under the coronavirus lockdown? How have you managed to make the switch, or have you managed to make the switch to remote learning and everything on the internet?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, I've been really encouraged, actually. I was worried, as you can imagine, about first of all, about the well-being of my faculty and students. I was very, very worried that we would have a number of deaths, and we've really sadly lost some very, very dear colleagues. Will Goodman, Bill Mencken, obviously, our closest colleagues at Pratt, who passed away recently from, in both cases from, well, in Bill's case, actually not from COVID, but in Lou Goodman's case, from COVID-related illness. And similarly, you know, Michael Sorkin, who was used to teach at Pratt in the 1990s and then moved to CUNY, sadly passed away from COVID-related complications. And similarly, a lot of students have lost elderly grandparents and relatives. So we're grieving at the moment a bit, and that's quite challenging, I think. And for many of us, like faculty who worked with these people for decades, a lot of them had been at the school for a long time. But, you know, there was an expectation, I think, that the work would be compromised by what was happening, that we would see students underperforming. And in fact, the work's been astonishing. I mean, we've got, you know, in a week or two's time, we've got our show opening virtually along with every other school who's trying to be responsible towards their members and obviously their wider community. So the work, I think, is a real testimony to the fact that we have just incredibly resilient students. And I suppose the way I look at it is that actually, like, if they can get through a pandemic in a final year of an architecture degree or even any kind of design degree and do so brilliantly, then frankly, you know, whatever comes next for them is going to be nothing like as challenging as this. This is the ultimate test on their ability to adapt, survive and thrive. And I think they've done astonishingly well. So I think that, you know, it's a funny kind of community being, you know, in a school of architecture in a pandemic. I often look at Zoom and think, oh my God, I'm in the Muppet Show, you know, the bit at the end where they all sing in their little windows, you know, and it's infuriating, as well as also somehow kind of democratizing when everybody's window is equal. But I think that, you know, I think that really students have been astonishing. I really am encouraged by their response, and I look forward to seeing what they do next.
What do you think the long-term implications of the pandemic will be, the negative and, if there is any, the positive, in terms of its impact, long-term impact on education to start with? Yeah,
it's a really good question. So firstly, in the US, to have online courses, you have to be licensed. And my school, like a lot of other schools, doesn't have a license to teach architecture as an online course. So this concession has been made because there is no other option, and it's obviously a requirement of the state, not the school. We haven't set this mandate as a satellite away from local government's instructions. So I think that one of the things that we're being forced to do is immerse ourselves in all of these new tools. And, you know, Zoom is one platform, but there are many, many others. And really, my faculty have been really quite brave in testing lots and lots of different platforms and lots of ways of creating studio culture, like that sense of community, that sense of camaraderie, that sense of mutual support and peer learning, which is one of the, I think, best bits of architecture education. And it's very challenging to do. So the interesting thing is, you know, well, on the one hand, you've got some people arguing that they're having an educational experience which is of less value than the face-to-face experience. My argument is, well, to some extent, you're actually kind of getting a double degree, because you're becoming really quite sophisticated technologists at the same time as qualifying as architects and designers, because you're never normally required to understand this much about virtual platforms in order to qualify, and now you are. So I think that really will open up the ways that we work in future. I mean, even within our school right now we have design reviews. Previously, we would only really bring people into our end of year exams who we could get here without flying them over many oceans and polluting the planet. Now we can bring in anyone from anywhere in the world just through Zoom. Of course, it's not the same, but it's really allowed us to diversify the panel profile. So much more regionally diverse, much more culturally diverse in that way. It isn't just a pool of who's in New York, but actually international representation. So there are some, maybe few, but some benefits, I think, to this situation. And I think we're trying to work with those benefits to think, if this is going to last a year, potentially 18 months, which is the risk, and it could be even longer, it depends. It really comes down to the responsibility or lack thereof of political leadership in, making sure that we're indoors or outdoors. It affects infection rates. But I think if we are in this for a year, if not two, maybe even longer, then we're only just going to get more sophisticated at this. And I think the tools will then need to keep up with us, because architects and designers are incredibly sophisticated problem solvers, and we exhaust platforms and software and devices very quickly. So I think when we start to become more active as co-developers in these platforms, then I think things are going to get more interesting and less one-dimensional.
And licenses to teach online aside, you said that the pandemic has meant you've been able to bring more diversity into the panels, but do the students actually need to be in New York as well? Could you have a Pratt educated student who never leaves Nairobi or Sao Paulo or wherever?
In theory, yes. In practice, there are time difference challenges, because I suppose for some, and this is obviously not just Pratt students, this is all architecture students who may have visa issues returning to the US, or indeed anywhere in the world that they're not from, that they've chosen to study in. So these time differences mean that some students are logging in at 2 in the morning, for example, if you're not careful. So it's really about, on the one hand, yes, keeping the timetable consistent, because the timetable is quite tightly packed. So if one class shifts, it crashes into another class, and then there's big disruption. So there's only so much you can do to work around quite a programmed curriculum, which is obviously what schools of architecture are. But then at the same time, there needs to be some slack. Otherwise, I don't really think it's fair for somebody, if it is Nairobi or wherever, logging in at 3 in the morning every day to have design studio. So there's some sort of mitigation there. So I think at the moment, there's a lot of discussions about how do we change this? How do we restructure timetables and periods of intense study, and then periods of reflection and self-directed study? Like, there's all kinds of models being explored right now. And every week, I mean, whatever being a dean was before this kicked off, it's now, I think, double the work, because you're kind of having to redesign everything you did right from scratch all over again to accommodate all of the, if you like, directives of the virus, because the virus, or at least those not responding properly to the virus, really dictating how, the circumstances I find myself in.
I spoke to Carlo Ratti, I think it was last week, and he said that he thought that the pandemic had exposed the fact that universities, and particularly the campuses of universities, were dinosaurs, was his phrase, that you have these vast campuses where people come and do everything together. He said that that's a model that is really inefficient and inflexible. Yeah. And it's great. The one great thing about a campus is that the serendipity, that the water cooler moment, or bumping into someone in a corridor or in a path or whatever. But apart from that, he felt it needed to change, and this could be the trigger for that. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. I mean, so firstly, I think face-to-face is really important to students, and design studio culture is more than water cooler. It's about that ability to collaborate and connect and learn from each other and work side by side, literally, for very long days, whether it's sharing a 3D printer or even just talking through an essay. All those things that students, that informality, as well as the structured teaching within that space that's very maker-led, because obviously that's the great thing about design studios across all design disciplines, is that the research process is all about kinetic learning, all about making in order to think, and then having the connectivity and exposure to other people's ways of making and allowing that to infiltrate and influence your own. That ecology is so essential to designers' inspiration, sense of community, and also cultural creativity. And that's really something that's incredibly hard to reenact within, I think, an online environment, no matter how hard we try. I think that, you know, it's a point taken that, you know, campuses are big ships. You know, it's like you know, a bit like a Titanic approaching the iceberg. It takes a long time to turn a big ship around, you know, when you've got something like a virus looming on the, you know, the starboard bow. But I think that one of the issues is that we still need that connectivity. We still need that community. And for many students, you know, and I'm thinking a lot really about, you know, from my experience as well, coming out of, you know, Council Estate in Manchester and going to this university where the kind of campus culture was that sense of separation. It was that sense of being able to be in a completely different environment, being completely physically and sensorially immersed in a whole new area, a whole new community. And I think especially when I look to my first generation students whose parents have never had the opportunity to go to college, I think for them, that is so, in a way, so essential that they kind of feel that they belong in a new context, physically, as well as kind of like conceptually or contractually, because they're studying with us. And I'm a big believer in that, the idea of having that physicality as part of our curriculum. I think it allows people to really come into that campus as equals. It doesn't matter where they're from, what community or region or context or class, they can come in and it's a melting pot. And that to me is a really important part of creating relevant and exciting and innovative design.
And finally, during your presentation, you talked about how when the current generation of students leave, they'll go into a very different type of practice post-COVID. How do you think the pandemic will affect the way architecture is done in the studios and the practices? And also, how will it change architecture itself? How will it change public space, private space, circulationary space, and so on and so forth? But practice first, because you said that there would be a different type of practice.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, firstly, I think that already we know that architecture and design practices, just if you look at the fees decline alone, are not necessarily sustainable in an economic sense. And I think it's a lot to do with clinging on to old notions of what spatial production is and what it should involve and who it's really for. So I think there needs to be a questioning of how we reassert our relevance to the needs of society, and that includes a direct confrontation with social justice and inequality within diverse communities, and also the problem of the climate crisis. So I think that principally, again, coming back to the point I made earlier about students needing to start reimagining, I would say, a more sustainable design industry is really about imagining what a business model looks like. What should its focus be? Who should be within its membership of the practice? What issues should it be addressing? So it's, you know, we talk about it as, I guess, in entrepreneurship and innovation, this idea that, you know, I mean, that to me are terms that have been overly exhausted and largely appropriated by the kind of, you know, the commercial kind of business management graduates. But really, we lack that in architecture education. We lack an understanding of the need to encourage our students towards trying to use their three-dimensional problem solving to really reinvent the sector, reinvent the industry. And I think that's how, to some extent, they will be changing the nature of the industry after COVID, because a few really obvious things have occurred. One, we realized that the supply chain at the moment, in terms of construction materials and everything else, is grinding to a halt, because obviously there's not much moving around right now in terms of materials. That adds more pressure towards being more sustainable and resourceful. We also know that, you know, 7% of the construction industry globally is a slave. That's pretty worrying for a sector. It's one of the worst sectors, because we don't question where our materials come from and how we use it. We also don't seem to be that bothered about the fact that what we do after, with our objects and artifacts and spaces, if they're toxic or they don't biodegrade, that's not really a problem. And whereas I look at my students now, and they bring into the studio, whether we teach it or not, they bring into the studio environment concerns about the climate, about veganism, about other species care. They're so much more oriented towards collectivism and collaboration than my cohorts were when I was a student some 20 odd years ago. She mumbled under her breath. So I think, you know, I'm really encouraged by the way that they are reminding us of our obligations, not just towards the world at large, but to them as a community, because they are extremely more disadvantaged than any student cohort I've ever known, and even cohorts preceding mine, because they have this incredible burden of debt, which really should be written off, because it's only actually going to deplete entrepreneurship and innovation, because if you're servicing debt, you don't have the money to start up a new business. And actually, you know, it's only the elite that own the debt anyway at the end of the day, because it keeps getting sold on. So it's just, I don't know, let's stop paying it. But I think, you know, we have an opportunity here to sort of give the students, I think, learning experiences which will allow them to be more radical when they get out into practice and really do something about these inequalities through a transformation of business models, principally, not just the products, but also the processes. And I'm really encouraged to see them do this. I think they will.
And do you have any thoughts on how architecture itself will need to change? Will we require different spaces and different models of play?
I'm sorry, you broke up slightly. What was the question?
Yeah, we lost each other for a second there. Do you think that the coronavirus will have any lasting impact on architecture itself? So the way buildings are designed, cities. I mean, in New York, I was reading this morning that like 30% of the wealthy people in New York actually left the city at the beginning of the lockdown period. Does this have implications for the density, for the way cities are used, or even is it a threat to cities?
Yeah, I mean, that the social distancing thing explains precisely why minorities in New York are dying at a far higher rate than the white middle class and upper class, because minorities are more likely, because of basically structural pay differentials. Put it this way, African American families earn 20% less now than they did in the 1950s, just to put it in perspective. And that's, you know, unfortunately because of really structural racism that's continuing, which is why the colonial project is not yet over. So I think that at the moment that's going to continue, because it's, even if they try their best with sanitizers and face masks, the ability to social distance is really impossible if you're living in very, very high density dwellings. So I think that unfortunately for us, we're going to see the virus really ravage those communities, unless there's some major interventions. And I know that unfortunately there just isn't the political will, or even some would argue the budget, to accommodate that. But I just think, you know, we've got to start thinking differently about how we configure homes. I mean, you know, for us at the school, we're obviously trying to imagine what would a hybrid fall look like? What would it look like if we could? We have to restrict access just to our building, you know, in terms of social distancing in studios. How could we reconfigure our spaces around that? How many people could we accommodate on shifts? These are questions all schools are asking themselves. I think all schools and all businesses are going to be doing some form of kind of social distancing space. In terms of a lasting impact, I suppose, I mean, it would be super helpful if we stopped eating animals that we're not supposed to, for one, to allow these things to show up in the first place. But more generally, I think, you know, architecture needs to be able to be much more secure and responsive when viruses or crises erupt. And I think principally at the moment, you know, big swathes of New York are going to be underwater within a decade because of climate change or the climate crisis. So I think actually, you know, yes, COVID is one preoccupation all designers have, but again, we can't divorce it from some of the meta issues around the survival of the planet right now. They're interlinked, but it's also, one has to be cautious not to think that post-COVID is all about COVID. It's actually about addressing some of the ongoing and perennial and persistent inequalities and environmental problems we're facing.
In terms of facing, and this is my final question, in terms of facing those social and political and environmental problems, you've arrived in America precisely at a time where the political structure there seems to be turning the clock back on a lot of those issues. Of course, you've come from the UK, which is, we can't say we're doing particularly any better. But I mean, are you optimistic that there's a chance that things can be made better, or it must be hard to put on the TV in New York every day and see what's going on in the kind of broader political sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge conversation. We should have a whole other hour on political infrastructure, but you know, whether it's gerrymandering or whether it's electoral college, which is obviously set up by the slave owners as a means to not have one person, one vote, but to create a system which is really about tiny populations of white people having equal votes and huge populations of black people in the US. And similarly in England, with the way that the electoral boundaries are drawn there, and obviously which is why Margaret Thatcher adjusted so many of them to kind of set it up to have, you know, quite a long lasting conservative rule, and which were quite successful in that regard. So I think that again, it comes back to, in my view, understanding that politics is a design problem. So we need to start looking at how can we design a better democracy to make things more inclusive. I suppose I'm optimistic anyway that the younger people are far more politicized, not because they're necessarily, you know, paid more attention than we do. They just have no choice. They're being put into an extremely challenging situation. The inequality of their experience compared to their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation is so acute that they have no choice but to be political. And I think that's the issue here, that as that generation matures and more people grow, you know, the ranks grow, if you like, then we would hopefully start to see a shift in political representation, both in the UK and the US, and that will change the way things look. I mean, looking at Brexit, for example, majority of, you know, young people voted to remain in Europe, and people, you know, something like over 1 million people who actually voted to leave Europe are now dead already because they were the older generations. So I think we really have to start looking at democratic models that allow the people who are going to be still living and have to inhabit these decisions to have potentially a bit more say in them, because I don't think at the moment any of the democratic models in both UK and the US are serving the population equally or fairly.
Does politics interest you at all personally?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, I think that maybe 20 years ago, when I think back on my old deans and professors and so on, they really had one responsibility as school leaders, and that was to get people out the door with a qualification, and that was pretty much it. There was a little bit of interaction with validation requirements and so on, and a few institutional politics to deal with, but nothing like the obligations of a modern dean. You know, we're looking at students' psychological health, we're worried about their you know, social isolation right now, especially, and that impact on mental well-being. We're worried about how much money they have. We're worried about their safety. We're worried about, you know, whether or not they'll have jobs because we're now tipping into a recession. We're worried about whether or not the industry will sustain them because it seems to be in decline. So, you know, it's like not just about curriculum pedagogy, it's about everything. And I think that, you know, it's either you could turn your back on it and just focus on making sure that everybody gets a beautiful little qualification with an imitation wax seal and a yellowing certificate, or you can really make it about ensuring that these young people have a chance to confront the inequalities they're facing and confront the injustice that's happening, I think, across the world right now, in the hope that we could do something about it.
And you said you felt that there's signs that the sexual profession is in decline. What did you mean by that?
Well, for example, if you look at fees, and if you look at the proportion of people working in the industry, so we already know that automation is going to get rid of about 10% of the UK's jobs within the next decade. That's going to have a major impact on employability, which is why you've seen a big campaign for living wages and all the rest of it, and other forms of compensation for non-workers, because there just won't be the jobs, right? So in a way, people staying home and being furloughed is a taste of what's to come as automation continues to increase. The construction industry and design industry more generally has been very slow to automate, far behind even agriculture, you know, which is kind of remarkable. So I think that, you know, as we start to embrace these technologies, so many aspects of every designer's role become redundant, which is why you've seen a shrinking workforce, for example, in architecture in the US, because there just isn't the need for that many people to work in the same way. And if you look at the UK as another comparable example, same problem, but also the issue is around the fact that you see a real decline in what architects and designers are paid for their work. So this devaluation and decline, not just of, if you like, the population of the construction industry and design industry, but also its value, is at the moment only traveling in one direction. So there needs to be, I think, really entrepreneurial things, ideas coming out of schools if we're going to turn that around.
Okay, Harriet, it's been great talking to you. Thanks.
Likewise, Marcus, with your green background. It's very nice. Very soothing to stare at somebody with this green thing. It's like calming.
And your animals seem to have calmed down, so maybe it's had a calming effect on them as well.
Yeah, they've all wandered off. It's great.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not activists, but yeah, thank you so much. It's great to talk to you.
Not too long.
Cheers. Yeah, stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.